Hi, this is John Harter, and welcome to episode 22 of Keep On Grooving. This time out, we'll take a look at the guest appearances Jimmy made after the formation of the Experience, then go over some of the artists who covered Jimmy's songs, as well as a number of the tribute albums done over the years. There'll be a few surprises along the way. Episode 22, Guest Appearances, Covers, and Tributes, Part 1, 1966 to 1992. Originally, this was going to be one big episode taking us from 1966 all the way up to the current day. But as I kept adding things along the way, it kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So I'm splitting it in half. It'll basically track from the beginning of the Experience right up to the early 90s. Lots of little bits I kept remembering, so as they got added in, the pre-tribute portion got long enough to be its own episode, so here it is. As we've gone over in earlier episodes, particularly the rundown of Disc 1 of West Coast Seattle Boy and last episode's Curtis Knight material, Jimmy worked with a lot of well-known artists in his pre-Experience days. Once it became well-known, a lot of people wanted to work with him, but not many actually did. His first guest appearance was definitely an unofficial one. In early October 1966, Chas Chandler brought Jimmy to sit in with the hottest new band in England, Cream. The supergroup of Eric Clapton, Jack Bruce, and Ginger Baker got together over the summer and started making waves in the English music scene. For a newcomer to come sit in with these guys was a big thing. Ginger didn't get why they'd bother letting some new guy play with them, but when he kicked in the killing floor, Eric and Jack were impressed. Eric struck up a friendship with Jimmy, and Jack ended up coming up with the riff to Sunshine of Your Love as a tribute. Jimmy would return the favor when he started playing the song in concert as a tribute to them as they announced their breakup in 1968. Jimmy made an impression on many of the hot guitarists of the era. Pete Townshend had conflicting issues with Hendrix. The Experience was signed to The Who's own label, Track Records, so there was a little rivalry right there off the bat. Then, of course, there was the incident on the final night of Monterey where the two would not follow each other, so Papa John Phillips had to flip a coin to figure out who went on first. The Who won and put on a killer set of their own, ending with the destruction of their equipment during My Generation. Jimmy answered in kind and did pretty well on his own. But Townshend saw what Jimmy was doing is taking what The Who did up to a different level. The bands went in different directions after that, the Experience ending 2 years later, while The Who is, well, still going to this day. Now, Jeff Beck is an interesting case. According to Townshend, the first time Jimmy showed up, Pete met Jeff Beck coming out of a club, and the Yardbirds guitarist said to him he was ripping off Pete's whole act. Yet, if you asked Beck, he was so blown away, he thought about just giving off and going to work at the post office. As I mentioned in the Dagger episode, I don't know if the third Yardbirds guitarist, Jimmy Page, ever had any major interaction with him. He also impressed some younger guitarists as well. In late 1967, a group out of Detroit, the Amboy Dukes, recorded their own take of the blues classic Baby Please Don't Go, like them did, with Van Morrison in the early 60s. But in the middle of the solo, their wild young guitarist, a gentleman named Ted Nugent, couldn't help but throw in a little nod to Jimmy by doing the main theme, Third Stone from the Sun, right there. And this wouldn't be the last time that song would be put to use in a break section. It appears the first time Jimmy had a semi-cover done was on, of all things, an album by Bill Cosby. Yes, that Bill Cosby. In 1967, he'd done an album where he took familiar songs and put new lyrics over top of them. He took Stevie Wonder's Uptight and turned it into Little Old Man and ended up hitting the top 10. A year later, he put out Hooray for the Salvation Army Band using Purple Haze as the musical basis for the song. Jimmy wasn't credited here, but in that music book that I talked about in an earlier episode, the one with the bad guitar tabulations, the one that had taken care of no business before it ever appeared, they had the transcription for this song included. Guess they must have worked out something, and Dr. William H. Cosby went on to TV fame as Chet the Gym Teacher on The New Cosby Show. Not sure what he did after that. Right. After the Cream sit-in, Jimmy didn't do many guest appearances in 1967. He did appear on the cover of Frank Zappa's We're Only in It for the Money as a spoof of Sgt. Pepper's, but that got yanked and didn't show up until years later. The trip to Monterey did lead to some fruitful later collaborations. A jam at Stephen Stills' house not only led to their friendship, but reconnected him up with Buddy Miles. They'd met each other back in their Chitlin Circuit days, though it was as far from the Chitlin Circuit as you can get, Montreal, Canada. Miles was in the band Electric Flag with Mike Bloomfield. They'd also played Monterey. Electric Flag played Saturday night while Jimmy played Sunday night. They began dropping in on each other's sets here or there, with Buddy making a memorable appearance at an early February 1968 date at Winterland, playing drums on a long jam of Dear Mr. Fantasy. Soon after that, he appeared on Electric Ladyland on the Rainy Day Dreamaway twofer. The Electric Flag had broken up, and he thought about putting together his own band, where Jimmy would end up tangentially being involved here and there. In the meantime, manager Mike Jeffrey thought it would be a good idea to have Jimmy try to spread his magic, as it were, to other bands he was managing. During the TTG sessions in October 1968, Jimmy produced sessions for the Irish band Heir Apparent and played bass on a demo for former Soft Machine leader Robert Wyatt on the song Slow Walk and Talk. These really didn't go anywhere. But another Mike Jeffrey managed artist did end up getting a hit with Jimmy's help. Cat Mother and the All Night Newsboys were kind of a garage band, but those were popular at the time, think like the MC5, Blue Cheer, and early Grand Funk. They came up with a medley of 50s rock songs called Good Old Rock and Roll, not to be confused with Old Time Rock and Roll by somebody else, and it ended up making it to the top 40, going all the way to number 21. Oddly enough, one spot below where Jimmy's highest charting single would hit all on the Watchtower, namely at number 20. In 1969, Jimmy and Buddy crossed paths again, this time with a new band in tow, the Buddy Miles Express. Jimmy contributed some liner notes to their first album, Expressway to Your Skull. The two worked together several times in February and March of that year. First, in February, before the trip to England and Royal Albert Hall, Jimmy produced 4 songs for the Buddy Miles Express's next album, Electric Church: Miss Lady, 69 Freedom Special, Destructive Love, which began life as I Can See, and My Chant. In March, they did some more recording, though those remained unreleased at the time. Blue Window from the Martin Scorsese Blues album, and 2 with Lonnie Youngblood, Georgia Blues and Let Me Move You. That was the last official producer credit for other artists that Jimmy would have. After the Experience broke up and prior to Woodstock, Jimmy rented a house in Shoken, New York, which is near Kingston, Hutter Mountain, and the actual town of Woodstock, as well as Saugerties, where Woodstock 94 was held. He tried putting his new band together as well as holding jam sessions at a local theater with anyone who showed up. One of these was piano player Mike Ephron. Somehow he managed not only to get recordings out of he, Jimmy, and Juma jamming on various tracks, including loose versions of future recordings, he got 3 albums worth out of them. An early version was a bootleg called This Flyer, but later versions came out under the name, I kid you not, Jimi Hendrix at his best. Anybody buying this and giving it one listen would conclude, no, it's not. Not going into too much detail on these, my buddy Purple Jim's site does a nice rundown of them, and he has links to further explanations. So if you want to get more into these, head over to the Hendrix Guide site. You'll find all the info you could possibly ever want to know about these things there. Jimmy was consumed the rest of the year with 2 legal issues: his lawsuit from PPX and the album needed to fulfill it, and his drug bust in Toronto back in May that wouldn't come to trial until December. Once 1970 arrived and both issues got resolved, the first with the Band of Gypsies album, the second in an acquittal, Jimmy was able to help out his friends once more, as well as work on more of his own material. His quick trip to London in March 1970 had him give 2 old friends some assistance. Stephen Stills was recording his solo album there, and Jimmy contributed a solo to the song Old Times, Good Times, which made the album. A different jam did not, one entitled No Name Jam, when Stephen Stills released it on his Carry On box set. In reality, the jam did have a name and lyrics. I can't repeat them here as the song's actual title is White N-Word. Guess it's a counterpoint to his song Black Queen. Arthur Lee of Love was recording their new album False Start over there, and Jimmy played guitar on the opening track Everlasting First, which appeared on West Coast Seattle Boy. The last thing Jimmy appeared to work on outside of his own material was Mojo Man by his friends the Ghetto Fighters. The Allen, or later Aleem brothers, did backing vocals on Isabella, Freedom, and Dolly Dagger, so I guess this was kind of Jimmy's way of helping them out. They recorded their album down at Muscle Shoals, where they got the Swampers. They brought the tape up to Electric Lady, where Jimmy did his part. Unfortunately, like several of Noel Redding's albums, theirs never got released. The song had made the rumor round for years and was teased for release on an album we'll talk about probably next episode. It finally made it out on People, Hell, and Angels. However, thanks to Nico's site, it appears the song actually did make it out as a single by a band called the Jet Set. Wasn't what it originally was, but the song was out there. Once Jimmy died, the tributes began to pour in, though not many in the form of cover tunes, at least at first. One of the earliest ones was from his old friend Eric Clapton. A few days before Jimmy died, he said he saw him at a Sly Stone concert in London, but was unable to meet up with him. He returned to Miami to finish recording the Layla album when word spread of Jimmy's passing. The sessions were already fraught with emotion, the album's material mostly stemming from Eric's longing, lusting, yearning for his buddy George Harrison's wife, Pattie Boyd. Unable to get her, he drowned himself in heroin and poured the raw emotions into the songs. However, a good thing that happened was his meeting with Duane Allman, arranged by producer Tom Dowd. The two seemingly different guitarists hit it off immediately, with Eric extending an invitation to Skydog to play on the album. They started recording in late August, then both Derek and the Dominoes and the Allmans had to hit the road. When Duane returned in October, the two decided to pay tribute to their peerless peer by recording their version of Little Wing. But this was no quiet lyrical number. The two masters turned the song into a wailing 5.5-minute epic of power chords and multiple solos, while Eric and Bobby Whitlock traded heartfelt, emotionally wrenching vocals. There's a thought out there that this version is way over the top, but if you think of it as two guitar greats paying tribute to a third, it almost couldn't be any other way. When the Dominoes did the song live without Duane, Eric utilized his wah-wah pedal as a further tribute to his fallen friend. For decades, Eric tended to avoid Little Wing and Jimmy's music overall. That changed in the early 90s, which we'll get to eventually. There's one more Jimmy connection to Duane Allman, and it's an unlikely one. One night, Duane had a dream Jimmy was in his kitchen. Jimmy headed over to the sink and showed Duane a song by using the faucet as a guitar neck. Duane got up and immediately put the song down on tape. That song ended up being one of his last before joining Jimmy and the Great Band of the Sky, a song called Little Martha. After that, there really weren't too many other direct tributes as covers. Rod Stewart had his band The Faces join him on 1972's Never a Dull Moment. There they covered Angel, a song which also ended up on the band's later live album Coast to Coast. Otherwise, the 70s were generally quiet on the Jimmy cover front. Canadian Frank Marino's band Mahogany Rush dedicated their first album to Jimmy and covered several Jimmy songs over the course of the next few years, including All Along the Watchtower. I know it's Dylan, but, and Purple Haze. Dave Mason also covered Watchtower on his live album, but considering he played on the actual recording, I think he's entitled to a piece of the glory. Earlier, Leslie West dedicated the song Tired Angels off of the album Nantucket Sleigh Ride to him. Jimmy and Leslie were in the studio at the same time when Mountain was recording their climbing album, and Jimmy got to hear the first playback of the song Never in My Life. There were, however, a couple of collaborative albums aside from the bunch PPX was putting out. In 1971, Maple Records put out Jimi Hendrix and Lonnie Youngblood, two great experiences together. I'm sure most people who saw this thought, who the heck is Lonnie Youngblood? From the past couple of episodes, we know Lonnie was a friend of Jimmy's from his days with the Squires and worked with them on some sessions for producer John Brantley. These included 4 single sides: Go-Go Shoes, Go-Go Place, Soul Food, That's What I Like, and Goodbye Bessie May. There were a few other session recordings as well. So Jimmy dies and they figure, we've got songs with Jimmy on here, let's use them. Only as usual, it's not exactly what they do. The album itself included the following tracks: Wipe the Sweat, Sweat Segue 2 and 3, 2 and 1 Goes, Goodbye Bessie May, All I Want, Under the Table 1, 2, and 3, and Psycho. Now, Jimmy is actually on these tracks. They were all backing tracks done for either Lonnie's songs or other artists that we talked about on the West Coast Seattle Boys set on disc 1. The 2 and 3 are alternate takes or edits of Wipe the Sweatin' Under the Table. Instead of going through all that work, why didn't they just release the 4 Lonnie Youngblood singles instead of just Bessie May? Like the PPX recordings, alternates of these backing tracks with alternate vocals or not made it out, mixed with numerous quote-unquote fake tracks with guitar by Herman Hitson. Proceed with caution for any of these albums. It would be helpful if experienced Hendrix got a hold of these recordings and put them out in some form. Maybe they already do and they just didn't do it for the 2010 box. The more dubious of the 2 collaborative albums was one with Jimmy and his 1965 boss, Little Richard. Jimmy did play on 2 songs with Mr. Penniman that were included on the 2010 box. I Don't Know What You've Got, But It Got Me, and Dancing All Around the World. What is included on this album is Little Richard singing versions of his own classics and other early rock and roll hits, and Jimmy is on none of them. Somehow the version of Lordy Miss Claudie that's on here made it to the live and unreleased radio show. Did Alan and Bruce even double check to see that Jimmy was actually on the song? I think by that point in 1988, it was pretty clear to everyone that Jimmy wasn't on this album. Shameless. That will actually get a mention later on. The main tribute that came out in the decade came from a very odd source. Jazz arranger Gil Evans was best known at the time for his work with Miles Davis on albums like Miles Ahead and Sketches of Spain. In 1974, Evans' orchestra put out an album of jazz-influenced covers of Hendrix songs, imaginatively titled The Gil Evans Orchestra Plays the Music of Jimi Hendrix. The album opened with Angel, a song that should have been on easy listening stations' playlists from the day it came out. A couple of medleys followed, Crosstown Traffic and Little Miss Lover for the first, and Castles Made of Sand and Foxy Lady for the second. An extended workout on Up From the Skies began side 2, followed by 1983, A Merman I Should Turn to Be. The most interesting take was an arrangement by tuba player Howard Johnson of Voodoo Child. In this case, Howard Johnson is wrong. It doesn't quite work. The album ends with Gypsy Eyes. The later CD reissue would add a second take of Up From the Skies and a take on Little Ring recorded the following year in 1975. Hard to believe that one didn't make the album right out of the gate. This wasn't the last time Gil Evans' versions of Hendrix songs made it to LP. In the 80s, the orchestra would play jazz club Sweet Basil's on Monday night. Now, what a choice music lovers in New York had on Monday nights in the 80s. Les Paul would play Fat Tuesdays on Monday nights as well. I'll get back to him in a minute. So Evans would make sure Jimmy's music had a prominent place in the sets. They ended up releasing 3 albums from their nights there. Volume 1 contained live versions of Voodoo Child. The tuba version didn't sound much better live either. And Up From the Skies. Volume 2 contained an extended take of Stone Free, including a prelude. A third volume came out in 1988 called Farewell, since it was released after Evans' passing and had a 15-plus minute version of Little Wing. Evans' versions of Up From the Skies and Little Wing would make a future appearance that will be heard by a wider audience thanks to the singer who would choose to cover them. More on those versions when we get to the 80s. I mentioned Les Paul before, and I meant to do a story regarding him last time since it fit into that era, but I wasn't really able to work it in. So here's as good a place as any. The guitar legend lived in Mahwah, New Jersey from the mid-60s forward. It's right up by the New York State border where Route 17 meets the New York State Thruway. Route 287 goes by there now as well. In 1966, Paul was driving around northern New Jersey, doing some things, doing some errands. He stopped by a club and heard a young guitar player trying out. He was really impressed by what he heard, but was in a hurry and couldn't stay to talk or hear more. Once he was done with what he was doing, he stopped by the place again on the way back to see if he could find out more about him. The club owner says he didn't hire him because he played too loud. He didn't get his name either. A year or so later, Paul's son bought him a bunch of new albums so his dad could get an idea what the music scene sounded like at the time. So Les is going through the records when he sees one and his eyes go wide. He's like, That's him. That's the guy I saw. And what was the album? Are You Experienced? As we got into the 80s, Jimi Hendrix albums were still coming out, but they didn't really have a very wide audience covering his material. In the early part of the decade, the main exception was a young guitar player out of Texas named Stevie Ray Vaughan. He was the younger brother of Fabulous Thunderbirds guitar player Jimmy Vaughan, but had a much flashier style. After playing in a number of local bands, his own band Double Trouble played the Montreux Jazz Festival, which caught the attention of David Bowie and Jackson Browne. Browne got him into the studio to record an album, and Bowie asked him to play guitar on his upcoming album Let's Dance. While those don't contain any Hendrix material, he was doing covers of some of Jimmy's songs live. Early recordings have him doing rarities like Manic Depression and even Driving South. Once he got to his second album, he wanted to get Jimmy on it. He ended up recording 2 covers. Voodoo Child made the record and ended side 1. He didn't do it radically different from Jimmy, but he did it at his own pace and rhythm. He made it his own while still paying homage to one of his early favorites. The other cover he did was a long instrumental version of Little Wing. This didn't make the album, but was released later on the posthumous album The Sky is Crying. It kind of split the difference between Jimmy's version and Eric and Dwayne's version on Layla. It started out quietly but more forcefully, then broke out strongly during the chorus sections. It quieted down for a later verse, then wailed out towards the end. He perfected it during live shows where he did it as a medley with Third Stone from the Sun. Now on that one, SRV went to town. He basically just did the back half of the song centered around the main theme. From there, he'd have the guitar make all kind of noise, laying it down on the ground and yanking the strings, that kind of thing. He'd also play behind his head and back on various songs, including Voodoo Child. His next album, Soul to Soul, added keyboardist Reese Winans to the lineup. To show him off, the album started out with an instrumental centered around the guitar-keyboard interplay called Say What. However, you can almost immediately hear the influence of Rainy Day Dream Away on it. With the keyboards laying the foundation, SRV goes off on the wah-wah pedal. As I mentioned in the earlier episode when we talked about this song, when I made my cassette of the album, I put the first song down as Keep on Raining, Keep on Dreaming / Say What, parentheses, Soul to Soul. Wanted to make sure everybody knew what it was. Voodoo Child made the cut for his Live Alive album, but it's not very well regarded. No Jimmy directly on his last album, In Step. He concentrated on older blues classics there. Then in 1990, he joined Jimmy in the Big Heavenly Band. I was lucky enough to see him 6 weeks before the helicopter crash. My buddy Ray came along on a whim and was happy he did. As I mentioned, I got into Hendrix in 1988. My gateway to him was through Eric Clapton, and I only got into him in late 1986, early 1987. He was working with Phil Collins at the time, who'd been a longtime favorite, and still is, so that at least put him on my radar. Though, oddly enough, Behind the Sun didn't really move me to check him out, but that's the difference between high school and college. One of the guys in my hall at Rutgers, Mr. Featherstone, a.k.a. Feather, had the Clapton collection backtracking. He played it all the time, and it just grew on me. Then Eric and Phil played Madison Square Garden in late April 1987. They had an extra ticket. I went to see them, and that was that. That was also the show that Darren saw that got us linked up when we talked about it a year later when we started working at Pergamon. So in the summer of 87, I went on a Clapton binge, going through his career all the way back to Cream. I didn't do the Yardbirds of John Mayall until later. So my first real introduction to Jimmy was the version of Little Wing on Layla. A few months later, in the fall of 1987, another well-known artist released his version of the Hendrix classic, Mr. Gordon Sumner, a.k.a. Sting. His second solo album, Nothing Like the Sun, continued his jazz vein that he started to mine with Dream of the Blue Turtles. This time he got Gil Evans in on the act, putting the lyrics to a more pop but still jazzy version of Little Wing. It was quite a contrast to the one on the Layla album. Hiram Bullock contributed a very lyrical solo, with Sting bandmate Brandon Marsalis taking a sax solo. But that wasn't all. Later on in 1988, when the song Englishman in New York was released as a single, the B-side was an 11-minute version of Evan's arrangement of Up from the Skies. Considering the Police's punk roots, it was a bit surprising for him to do a bunch of Jimmy covers, but it turns out the first song he learned to play on guitar was Hey Joe, playing along with the Hendrix single. So, you never know. And then to bring this full circle, Clapton also appeared on Nothing Like the Sun on the song They Danced Alone, and also played on an alternate of the hit We'll Be Together. In the early 90s, Sting added Purple Haze to his set list. He even had it as a B-side to one of his singles and played it when he appeared on Arsenio Hall's show. Now, just to show you what my musical progress was, I bought my first two Hendrix albums, Smash Hits and Kiss the Sky, in June 1988, and finally heard the original version of Little Wing for the first time July 4th weekend on WNEW's Firecracker 500. I'm driving home from Pergament that Saturday night on Rogers Lane near Dunn's Corner Road in East Brunswick. They mentioned Hendrix would be part of the countdown, so I'm listening intently and hear this quiet little number come up. Since I'd only heard the Layla and Sting versions, I'd never heard the iconic opening with the chucking chorus going down the neck. Never heard it. I was stunned that it was only the one set of verses, not two like the other two versions, and that it was so short, 2 minutes and 22 seconds, and then it's gone. And to show you how this keeps circling around, my next exposure to Little Wing was a vinyl floppy record that included in a Guitar Player magazine special on Clapton, since Crossroads had just come out. It was Derek and the Dominoes doing the song during the run at the Fillmore East that was released on the In Concert album. I just got my first CD player in Christmas 1987, and one of the first CDs I got was In Concert since it wasn't available on cassette. So when I made a tape of that album, I included Little Wing along with the two live numbers that were included on the Crossroads box set, Crossroads and Key to the Highway, to make it a big 2-hour album. And this will not be the last time we'll hear Eric doing Jimmy's music. Another artist you wouldn't necessarily associate with Jimi Hendrix is Billy Joel. Now, to the best of my knowledge, he's never done an outright Jimmy cover, but he did have a couple of songs with acknowledged Hendrix influences. The second song on his 1986 album, The Bridge, was This Is the Time. When I was reading about the song, I believe it was in like the tour guide when we went to go see him in concert, guitarists Dave Brown and Russell Javers mentioned that they played the guitars on this song with a real Hendrix feel. Now, at this point, not having heard a lot of Hendrix, I had no idea what they were talking about. So when I bought Smash Hits in 1988, I'm listening to The Wind Cries Mary, and it comes on, and all of a sudden, this light goes on my head like, oh, that's what they meant by a Hendrix feel. Oh, man, it sounds almost exactly like it. Later in 1989, on the album Stormfront, side one ends with the song Shameless. Right before the chorus kicks in, there's a little build-up that sounds almost exactly like Bold as Love. Now, I mentioned this to my buddy Ray, who's a huge Billy Joel fan. Oh, he's not really a Jimmy fan. Not sure where that would come from. So we go to see him at Yankee Stadium in 1990, and after he finishes one song, he just yells out, "This one's dedicated to Jimi Hendrix," and they go right into Shameless. Hope you learn that when it comes to Jimmy, in the words of the Maha, don't doubt me. Garth Brooks also covering the song certainly helped its exposure. So Jimmy doing country music, well, you thought it would have been Night Bird Flying. Using a snippet of Third Stone from the Sun was a pretty popular thing to do. As I mentioned, Ted Nugent did it in his Amboy Dukes days. Santana did it as a medley with Coltrane's Peace on Earth on his 1990 album Spirits Dancing in the Flesh. Now that album has two other Jimmy connections on it. Carlos did a cover of Curtis Mayfield's Gypsy Woman, one of the songs Larry Lee sang at Woodstock, as well as a cover by Jimmy's former employers, the Isley Brothers, Who's That Lady, a song some people thought was inspired by Jimmy. Now, I'm not sure if the song ended up inspiring the later sitcom Third Rock from the Sun, but the connection's there if you want to reach for it. Also in 1990, Jimmy made a quick appearance in the top 10 in the rap section of Delight's number 3 hit Groove Is in the Heart. Jimmy's next appearance with another artist is important in that he gave him his first number one song in the United States on the Billboard Hot 100 singles chart. Now, it's as a songwriter, so put him in a category of guys like Bob Dylan and Bruce Springsteen, who had number one songs by other artists covering their songs, but as a performer, they never made it. Bob and Bruce did do better than Jimmy in that regard, both peaking at number 2. Now, it's not a straight cover. In fact, it's not really a cover at all. It just uses that little third stone snippet in a most unique place. A dance act named Right Said Fred came up with a little number after a bout of staring in the mirror. I'm too sexy for my shirt, so sexy it hurts. Now, this inherently doesn't have anything to do with Jimmy, but the guitar player decided to toss in the main theme from Third Stone from the Sun in the break section. These guys must have learned a thing from Mr. Van Winkle's bouts with David Bowie and Queen a couple years earlier, so right off the bat, Jimmy was given writing credit. That's how I first found out about it. I wasn't listening to Top 40 radio all that much at that point, but I regularly checked out the Billboard chart to some of the local record stores. They had it, hanging up by the singles section. So one day I'm looking at the chart and I see the name Hendrix jump out at me. I'm like, what the hell is Right Said Fred? So a few weeks later, we're coming back from some trip from a family member, and it's my sister's turn to have the radio on her station. So it's on like WPLJ or Z100, or one of the pop stations in New York back in like 1992. So right after the Divinals I Touch Myself plays, I'm Too Sexy comes on. And I'm like, no, geez, I got to see how Hendrix has anything to do with this. And then all of a sudden, in the middle of the song, boom, there's Third Stone from the Sun. I'm like, hey, that's a Hendrix song. Basically, when I hear the song these days, I just have this image of Idina and Patsy stumbling out of Harvey Nichols after a liquid lunch. Like, do we have to really go back to work, Eddie? Oh, not if you don't want to, sweetie. Before we move on to the tribute albums, we have one more artist who gave some tributes to Jimmy, and it's his former Reprise label mate, Neil Young. Neil's had a lot of ups and downs in his career that's been eclectic, to say the least. First hitting the big time of Buffalo Springfield with Hendrix pal Stephen Stills, he had it off on his own, as well as pairing up with the band Crazy Horse. Then later rejoining his former bandmate in his new band, making it an extended version as Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young. From there, he hit number 1 with Heart of Gold, headed into the ditch for a while, rejoined Stephen before leaving him with some dietary advice, eat a peach, hit movie screens with some thoughts about ferrous oxide, then made the biggest boo-boo of his career. In the 80s, he left Reprise for what looked like a better deal with Geffen Records. Fair to say, it didn't exactly work out. By the end of the decade, he was back with Reprise in time for another career revival. His commentary on the modern rock commercial scene garnered him a ban by MTV, before they gave him a Video of the Year award for the very same video they banned. He reteamed with Crazy Horse just in time to catch the wave coming out of Seattle. He fit in so well with that modern sound, he was given the title The Godfather of Grunge. In 1992, he returned to the countrified sound of Harvest with a sequel, Harvest Moon. One of the songs on it dealt with the influences in his life and his sound, from Hank Williams to Jimi Hendrix. A year later, Bob Dylan celebrated his 30th anniversary in the business with an all-star tribute concert. Neil's contribution was on the Watchtower, but of course based off of Jimmy's version rather than Bob's. In the 1988 MTV rockumentary on Jimmy, they only used a couple of sentences from a Neil interview, but one of them summed up his respect for him perfectly. There's no one even in the same building with that guy. Now, with all of that out of the way, next time, the tribute albums. Next episode, we'll discuss the tribute albums from the 90s and 2000s with their eclectic mixes of groups doing their cover versions of Jimmy's songs. That's next time on Keep On Grooving. One sad note to end on. Mo Austin, head of Warner Brothers Records for a long, long time, passed away this week at the age of 95. Among many other things, he was instrumental in getting Reprise Records up and going and getting Jimmy onto the label. Another legend is gone. Please remember to hit the subscribe button if you like what you're hearing. I'm John Harjar. Thanks for listening.